I'll be blunt. I went to India to kill myself. In a way, I got my wish. Life had become a bleak and gray thing that looked to be a prison woven out of countless invisible strands. Money, cubicle, bad food, bad sleep. I was 2 years out of college and seeing the rest of my years flowing straight ahead with no deviation and no freedom. Raised on video games and television, I was now expected to suddenly fit into a drone-like routine. Wake up far earlier than I ever had to before. Sit at work, going crazy from the boredom for 9 hours. Then drive home to eat, sleep, and do it all over again. Was this really life? I held out for another year before I knew I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't be a cog in the machine. But our world is not kind to young men who refuse the system. Every day on the way to work, I saw homeless people and how they were treated. I wouldn't go out like that. No, that was just a slow suicide all on its own. I'd always been fascinated by television shows about other countries, so I chose my favorite and I spent the remainder of my bank account on a ticket to India. Once I got there, once I had seen all the wonderful sights and experienced another culture, well, there was nothing after that. No plans, and once you're out of money, you're as good as dead anyway. It turned out India wasn't much different than home. There were coffee shops, crowded streets, jobs. The same bitter meal and just a slightly different scent and flavor. It shouldn't have been like that. It was supposed to be different. Another continent, but it was the same prison. I begged for change until I got enough to buy a bottle of sleeping pills. They weren't even that expensive, but the experience of asking strangers for money for 2 days straight was enough to convince me I was doing the right thing. I found a corner and I ate them all, a handful at a time. I don't even remember falling asleep. It was as if I had been thrust 1,000 feet deep under the ocean and I was rising. For a time, I thought I was free from my body and soaring up to heaven. But instead, I burst up out of the waters of Lethe and banged my head into wood. A bunk bed? No. My arms were sore and tingly from disuse, but they still listened. My half-numb fingers found a rough surface about 2 inches above my face. It was dark. Why was it dark? And why was it so hard to breathe? I began trying to flex my legs, but they didn't want to move. I managed to curl my toes after some effort, and then the pain in my thighs and ankles seared into my awareness. My legs were bent and must have had poor blood flow for quite some time now. I clenched my fists against the pain and just remained like that until the pain finally passed. After that, I tried to stretch and the truth hit me. I was curled up in a small wooden box. But why and where? I pressed against the sides of the box, but I felt absolutely no give. It was a poor quality wood with very little strength, which meant something had to be blocking it on the other side. And that meant, oh God. The bottle of sleeping pills must have nearly killed me, but not completely. They must have thought I was dead. They buried me alive. I was lucky to even have a box, really. As a foreigner, as somebody with no money, had someone put me inside it as an act of kindness? If they had just thrown me in the pit and buried me, I would have been dead already. The logic didn't seem to help the panic back for more than a few seconds. I began screaming and beating at the thin wood with all my strength. Bits of dirt sifted down from above, but I kept attacking the wood until it began pouring down like the grains in an hourglass. The air was stale and I was suffocating, but I had no better plan. I would either die now or find... Yes! They hadn't buried me deep at all. Maybe a few inches. Sunlight. I could see sunlight. And air. Air flowed in. Oh my God. The sweetest breath despite the choking dirt in the air. I screamed for help. But there was no reply. Was I in some sort of graveyard? Of course, I had to be. My shout had to be in reality a small whimper, but nobody would ever hear it. I waited, and didn't hear anyone. Every so often, I would shout as loud as I could. The light outside dimmed and went dark, and then reappeared over the course of a cold night. That morning, it began to rain. A little bit of water trickled down, and I drank as much as I possibly could. The box creaked as the dirt above grew heavier, and I was forced to roll onto my back and prop up the weak roof with my knees. I wasn't strong enough to bash my way up, but it could certainly fall in on me and crush me if I didn't do this. How do I convey what it's like to be buried alive? Every story I've read or movie I've seen focuses on the initial terror of waking up underneath the earth forgotten. That passed quickly. The era after that was an endless one of waiting, thinking, and guessing. Do I shout now? Do I wait? Do I conserve my strength and try to break up through the surface when the dirt dries out? I hope it doesn't rain so the earth will dry, but I hope it does rain so I won't die of thirst. But I also hope it doesn't rain too hard or I'll drown. And always, 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 the box is present, like part of your body. No matter what position you choose, you can feel every single side of it. It's right there with you, like a shell, like a second skin. You come to know every knot and grain in the dark. You even repair it and prop it up with your own strength, even though it's the damn thing that you were trapped inside. The box is death, but the box is also life. For 2 days, it didn't rain. Then, right about noon, judging by the initial brightness of my sole beam of light, a new darkness joined me in the box. I thought someone had walked over my grave and I began to shout, but no, it was a thunderstorm. I prayed, you bet I prayed. I'd never been a religious guy before, but please, please, I said, please keep this rain to a light drizzle. When an inch of water had built up around me in the box, I knew it was time to act. It was do or die. I practiced a pose worthy of Circus Olay, and I got into it now. Bare feet planted solidly in that inch of water, knees out, arms curled under, back against the ceiling. All inside a box about 2 feet high. I pushed. The wood cut into my back, but I pressed with all the strength left in my legs. There was a small give above, as if I was making a little bump in the dirt where some person might see it. I strained so hard, I put so much of myself into that attempt that I felt nothing else. I envisioned myself bursting free into the open air and rain, and that's all I had to do. My body gave out first, and I rolled onto my back to rest for a second try. Something up there had moved. I knew I could do it, given time. But the box betrayed me, and it caved in on top of me. Dirt poured in as I fruitlessly fought the flow. I put my mouth to a narrow air hole in an attempt to avoid suffocation. All I did was leave me completely trapped and totally unable to move while wet dirt squeezed in over my eyes and around my neck. I was entirely encased in dirt except for my mouth, which was open to the air, and the rain was intensifying. I drank as much rainwater as I could. I even began eating the traces of mud it brought down with it. Anything I could do to keep that narrow hole in the ground above clear. Eventually, though, the rain overtook me and I was forced to close my mouth and hold my breath. That was it then. There were no more plays, no more tries. I'd come to India to die, even tried to kill myself with pills, and yet here I was, fighting desperately down to the very last second, just to cling to my life for one moment longer. I was immobile underground, with a funnel of rainwater growing heavier on my closed mouth. How long could Olympic divers hold their breath? I'd seen a show once, while flipping through the channels. Was it 3 minutes? Was it 4? God, the pressure in my chest. I hadn't even gotten a full breath. 60, 61, 62, 63. I knew I was nearing my limit. What did I want to spend the last minute or two of my life thinking about? Girls I dated? My favorite movies? It was all nothing, but it was everything. Every mundane little thing in the entire world was now a luxury I would never have again. I would stroke the fabric of my cubicle at my boring job if only to see again, to breathe one more time. Thunder struck overhead so loud that I could hear it even in my prison of mud. I wish I could say that at the last moment the hillside gave way under the fury of the monsoon and spilled me onto a mudslide of corpses. That's what local law enforcement and doctors insisted on when I tried to tell them the truth. To them, I was just a crazy foreigner that had been traumatized by being buried alive. They refused to listen. Because I was not saved at the last second by the weather. In fact, I wasn't saved at all. I counted to 140 before my awareness started to halo out into a shimmering white. Keep my mouth closed. Keep my mouth closed. Keep my mouth closed. Water, dirt, mud, pressure. Keep my mouth closed. That was all that remained. If you open your mouth, you die. But if you don't breathe, you also die. No choices. Something was tugging at me just before I gave in. Something was pulling at me, not from above, but from below. Chilliness wrapped around my limbs and began to pull me down. I remember the spray of released rainwater as I shot down from the hole where it built up. Then I was dragged through the earth at a breakneck pace. Keep your mouth shut. Keep your mouth shut. No longer. I let out dead air and I gasped. Somehow I was alive. I'd been deposited somewhere full of soft round lumps and hard straight lines. The air here was breathable, but it was horribly foul. For as much as I wanted to escape the darkness, I let myself just be alive for a few minutes. I think I knew something was wrong, but it wouldn't begin until I opened my eyes. Finally, I was fully conscious again. Still dark, no light. I began to crawl across the piles. Long solid objects clacked against one another. Big round soft lumps rolled as I pushed my way across. As I went, I began to suspect, but I didn't truly know until my hand fell upon the unmistakable lay of a cold nose and mouth. The human head rolled away down the pile of bones I was crawling over. I saw nothing, but I knew what it was. Had the graveyard somehow rotted underneath? Had rainwater deposited all the bodies down in some sort of cave? I was alive, at least for the moment, but this was somehow worse than the box. At least in the box I could shout and pray someone would hear me. If I was in a corpse-filled sinkhole, well, there was nothing to do but starve. A fate which would take years if new bodies were continuously sliding down whenever it rained. God, what if I never died? What if enough water and human meat made it down here to keep me alive for decades? Could I really eat a corpse? It's funny, I hadn't actually cried while I was in the box. In that box, everything was so simple. But here, it's loneliness and starvation which could turn me into a monster. I crawled around that sinkhole for hours, testing each side of the massive pit. The sides were solid dirt and packed in hard by the ancient geological processes. There was a small span of time where I considered building some sort of scaffolding out of bones. There was certainly enough, and there were tons of clothes and hair that I could tie them off with. It was a grim thought, but seemingly the only way out. Until the door opened. There was no light, and I only heard it. In that sinkhole, there were only two sounds. The water draining away into a narrow crack between two hard plates of rock, and me. After at least 2 days down there, I knew the moment the door opened. It was nothing but a soft sigh of smooth metal and warm air, but I began moving toward it immediately. There was also a fourth sound. Something moved among the pile of bodies, sending bones scattering and heads rolling. It was swift and mostly silent, and it dragged something back out. I chased after it and dove into the gap that hadn't been there before. I got inside before it closed. Metal. Warm metal. It was still pitch black out, but I could feel the smooth, warm metal under my hands. A maintenance shaft, I guessed? But for what? Had some animal found a grate in the sewers and given me my escape? I felt behind me, but the door was solid metal. Not a grate and covered with unfamiliar sleek patterns. Checking, I found that I could push it open if I wanted to. It opened only from the inside, and I'd somehow missed it while feeling the sides of the sinkhole. I could go back if I wanted to, but to hell with that. I turned and I started to crawl ahead. There was really no way to tell how long this warm and smooth metal tunnel was. I'd been in darkness so long that I'd lost all sense of distance and time. I crawled until my hands and feet were too weak to move, and then I slumped along on my elbows and knees. This was going somewhere. This had to be going somewhere. I slept encased in warmth when I put my head to a soft round hump of metal. I could hear the rising and falling humming, as if everything around me was alive, asleep, and breathing softly, somewhere deep and distant. How long had I been underground by then? A week? For the first time in a week, I found light. When I awoke and I kept crawling on my sore hands, I finally emerged into an open chamber that held its own dim gray ambient glow. As happy as I was to finally see again, and even then, only the barest unknown darkness that any normal human eye would have seen in pitch black, had they not spent a week underground craving light. I also knew I was not nearly home or safe. Here, the sleek metal tombs of the tunnel expanded to form a sort of rectangular mortuary. There were no floor, only a maze of pipes overlapping one another. The pipes bulged upwards in places and in a series of table-like formations. On these knotted biers rested 6 corpses in various stages of decay. 2 of the tables were empty. Yeah, from bad to worse. But my time buried alive had beaten all the fear out of me. Death was no longer the worst possible outcome, and I had to keep going. The chamber had multiple ways out, and none of them looked official. I crawled up into the pipe-lined hole and hid there as I heard something sighing outside a large gap. As I squeezed myself tighter and tighter into shadow, I watched an enormous organic metallic hand on 1,000 joints slide in without a sound and pick up the farthest corpse in the row. From the sound, I knew that this was the thing that had entered the sinkhole. This is what had stolen a corpse. This had reached all the way down that interminable tunnel on its endless metal-jointed arm. And now it was taking one of the bodies to another chamber. Creeping by the dim ambient glow, I moved down the subtly pulsing tunnel beyond, following the arm as it receded into gloom. It was dangerous, and my heart threatened to pound through my ribcage, but I had nowhere else to go. I only barely caught my breath as I came face to face with a human skull. I nearly screamed. Set in the wall, no, it was part of the wall. It gaped with open eyes at nothing. Tubes of a dozen different varieties, all smooth chrome, had entered it through the ears and mouth and spinal cord area. The ends of those connections gleamed as spikes and fluid carriers. Had they once connected to something? Moving on, I followed the curve of the wide metallic cave until it reached what looked like a twin operating rooms. A steel bush of micro-arms hovered over a pipe bulge bare within each room, picking and clawing at a corpse on each table. Wait, no, it wasn't picking at it. I crept closer, wary of that greater arm that had deposited the left body and then departed somewhere. The body on the left table was long decayed, but tiny claws and surgical instruments on arms between 6 and 10 feet long appeared to be dipping into a wide bath in the floor. It was filled with random pieces of human flesh and then carefully applying those pieces to the skull of the dead patient. I slipped and tumbled into the room, nearly sliding into the vat of flesh, but gripped warm metal at the last second. Had I been caught? No. The surgical arms never even so much as slowed. They didn't care about me at all. I hugged the wall, knowing the same might not be true for that bigger arm. As I watched, the arms reconstructed the face of the human being. They did not rebuild his hair or skin, only the muscles around his skull, and then 2 eyes were plucked from the vat and inserted with great care. For the first time since I'd been buried alive, I felt vaguely not alone. Although the eyes just stared straight up, they had no eyelids and, as yet, no muscles to move them. What were these machines doing? The arms began filling the inner portions of the skull where I could not see. Then they flittered quickly down the table, piercing together a spine and the core of a nervous system. Between the ribs, the next things they fused together were 2 different lung sacs from the vat. A small arc of electricity shocked the heart placed in between them. The head, lungs, heart, and ribcage on the table began screaming. Loud echoes of terror and shock radiated out from our organic metal surgery room. I froze in absolute terror for an eternal moment, and then I jumped forward. I hissed, "Shut up, it'll hear you." The muscle-bound skull could not move, but the eyes sitting within did. Ever so slowly, those irises focused on me. Its windpipe moved visibly between its skull and septum. Its lungs contracted with effort, and it said something in Hindu. I put a finger to my lips. Shh. The reanimated half-body said one more sentence in Hindu, and then it closed its jutting jaw to signal that I would remain silent. Was it a man or a woman? What had it said? It watched me sidelong with terrified eyes as I climbed into another operating room. The same thing was happening there, but the process was not far along. The machines here were pulling from the vat filled with bone fragments and rebuilding the spinal column below a cracked skull. I must have rocked back and forth for a solid minute, as insanity of what I was seeing overwhelmed me. What the hell was this? I must have gone insane. I was still in that sinkhole. No. Whenever I turned and looked over my shoulder, I could see those horrified muscle-ringed eyes watching me, hoping I would do something. The surgical arms continued their work, adding more nerves and pieces of a circulatory system. The arms had seen fit to ignore me so far, but it was too dangerous to interfere with their work. To that man or woman on the table, I whispered, "I'll come back for you." I waited for a nod and I listened to a third sentence in Hindu, and then I had it on. I repeated the foreign syllables in my mind, hoping to memorize them and translate them later if I ever saw civilization again. Who knew what terrible secrets the reanimated man or woman had seen? The curve had continued, taking me through a cathedral-like area where pools of black water stank under a ribcage of thick metal bones dripping ichor from ancient tubing. The light here was still barely perceivable and so thin that I had to move my head back and forth to make out shapes. But it was definitely shifting from gray to blue as I climbed across the vast valley. At no place and no junction were there ever signs, text, or floors to stand on. Nothing about this place was for humans. I wasn't even sure if I was on the bottom, per se, as there were no difference between floors and the ceiling, or indeed, even the walls. The whole place could have been upside down or at an angle for all I knew. There was no intended orientation at all, and it all had grown haphazardly. Because grown had to be the right word. The metal conduits were warm and alive, and I couldn't find a single seam or welding mark. Perhaps a cave system had already existed here and a horrible seed of some sort had grown to fill it over the centuries. Or perhaps I was inside an enormous demon skull even now as I slept inside the earth and this was simply its body. The world was farce and this defied everything I'd ever known. Legs. The next vast chamber held hundreds of pairs of human legs jutting from the walls. Not for me. This chamber was not for me. It was too much. The mind cannot face some things. I climbed upwards, ever upwards, deeper into blue light. At the apex, the most excruciating dark blue light somehow sharp and dull at the same time. I found an oval room hosting a dozen odd dark devices and a face set in the wall at the end. It was the face of a woman and her eyes were closed. Tubes and conduits connected to her bulging head as I'd seen in that skull before, and my mind began to grasp something about the nature of this place. Aging, growth, change. I couldn't explain it in words, but the dark spirit behind those closed eyes. I knew that if she happened to wake and look my way, I would suffer a fate 10,000 times worse than death. The next ramp laid behind her. Moving as slowly and quietly as I could, I stepped from one round pipe to the next, my gaze jumping from my bare feet to her closed eyes twice a second. When I saw her twitched, I moved. Her lids opened slowly and I saw her eyes move gently back and forth, sweeping the room. She did not see me. I was clinging to the wall below, staring directly up at her chin. Her mouth did not open, but I thought I could hear a hum of suspicion. I counted out 2 hours after her lids had closed again before I crept along the base of the wall and up the ramp. Blue shifted to violet as I ascended. I kept going up and up and up, climbing pipes and avoiding things, and always staying quiet. There was a sleeping awareness about this whole place. A towering, monstrous machine waiting for ages, running pieces of itself on automatic in the meantime, but ever wary of intruders. And I found it there in the violet basilica, when the light became so painfully violet that I knew human eyes had never seen this place. I found a sleeping giant. It was mostly fetus, but mostly brain. It was maybe 10 or 15 times as tall as me, and it was floating suspended in dark ichor inside a glass tube that ran from a biomedical base right to the ceiling, unfathomably high above. As I stared in utmost horror and tried to comprehend it, as I watched its brain stomach expand and contract slowly as it breathed from thick tubes, I saw that it was just one of a dozen. Like massive pillars and double colonnades, I stood at the center of the giant cathedral built to worship and house horrific sleeping beings. I stood in the center, in a circle of pipes, and for the first time, I recognized the use of the space. If they had been awake, those 12s would have floated into their foul chambers and gazed down upon me in judgment. This was a court of some inhuman exotic law, and we had all just been judged guilty. I ran. I no longer cared about being quiet. My bare feet hammered along those uneven round conduits until I was through the basilica and beyond into darkness, where I was sure light still glimmered, but past violet, beyond what human eyes could see. I just kept climbing, hour after hour, sometimes up and sometimes down. And then I climbed up through a narrow tube, barely big enough for me to squeeze through, and I found myself back in the left operating chamber. Somehow I had gotten turned around and that had come full circle. That and I was on the ceiling now. Ports and biomechanical adaptations had been fitted to the ribcage on the operating table above, and skin had been grafted on and was now being fused together by medical lasers. I could now see that it was a woman, and she was staring up at me, both in confusion that I was on the ceiling and that I had returned. I had been right about the lack of an orientation in this horrible place. Could it? Yes, I had climbed up the wall and I felt my sense of direction adapt as I went. The entire time, I could have been walking on the walls or ceilings without knowing it. I had simply never tried to circle the chamber's sides rather than climb along the bottom as I understood it. The question it left me was simply, where the hell was I? And there was no escape except back to the sinkhole from where I came. I sat for a time with that Hindu woman, but we didn't know each other's language, so all we could do was just sit there and wait and pray. The larger claw soared by at regular intervals. I watched its arm twist and move as it worked farther on down the line, and I guessed that there were other operating rooms and likely other graveyards being pilfered from below. This was death. This was the afterlife for all intents and purposes. We put our dead in the ground and this place took them and rebuilt them for their own ends. There was nothing I could do. Although the table in the right chamber was rebuilding an entire skeleton, the Hindu woman near me only had her top half remade. Half biomechanical, half organic. She struggled as the large arm came to claim her. She screamed, but one of the surgical arms clamped and screwed a metal mask over her mouth, silencing her. I stood unmoving and clutching the walls until the large arm deposited another pile of bones and left the surgical table to its work. The arm didn't care about me. Nothing here did. A week must have passed while I wandered through those ghastly halls. There was nothing to learn, there was nothing to see, and nothing to figure out. No tools, no exits. I was beginning to starve, but I refused to do it. I refused. Even though there were whole vats of flesh just waiting to be eaten. I couldn't, and I wouldn't. The black ichor was water. It was stained water, darkened with something unidentifiable, but it kept me alive. Unable to bear the afterlife any longer, I eventually found a new oval room and I gave myself up. Among the black devices was a woman's face, just like the other blue-lit control room, and I waited for her to open her eyes. When she did, I recognized them. I knew those eyes. She spoke. Her mouth was masked and unmoving, but her voice came from the wall somehow. The words began in Hindu, but transformed into something unintelligible as the connections around her head bulged forcefully. The claw was upon me in moments. Chill, solid fingers wrapped around me, and I recognized the feeling. This claw had taken me down from the box and deposited me into the sinkhole. I was captured, and I expected to, what? Be torn apart? Killed? Become a cog integrated into the machine. Exactly what I had always feared, even before I'd been buried alive. The claw carried me at unnerving speed through blue, gray, and even yellow-lit biomechanical tunnels until darkness shrouded me and a rising sensation gripped my stomach. Finally we hit something hard and I was thrown free in a slurry of mud and water in the grip of a tremendous storm. She'd let me go. Somehow, the woman had used some shred of her human willpower to eject me from the afterlife. I couldn't save her, but she had saved me, at least for the moment. I was free. The odyssey that had begun with my suicide attempt was over, and I was back in the world of the living. I survived the storm and even tried to tell the authorities about what was waiting under the earth and stealing their death, but they all just laughed at me. It was also then that I learned a little bit of Hindu customs and that most Hindus are cremated. Did they suspect this? Did their ancestors somehow know what was going on under the earth and stealing the buried? The graveyard that I was buried alive in was a mix of various peoples and tribes, those who couldn't afford cremation and unclaimed foreigners. It was possible that the storm had wiped the entire thing away like I'd been told, but I suspected that the nightmare beneath had closed its sinkhole because my escape had compromised that particular location. While trying to understand what I had experienced, I translated the Hindu woman's 4 sentences and their meaning. To me, it's worse than anything that I witnessed. She said first, when she'd been just a muscle-bound skull and lungs, "Thank you, thank you." After I begged her to remain silent, she said, "I'm just happy to be able to move again." When I told her that I'd come back for her, she said, "Please don't interfere. I want this." And when I'd finally seen her as a part of that nightmare, as a face set in the wall and gagged for eternity, speaking only through biomechanical means, she'd said, "When we die, we stay where we lie. Our bones, our dust, remain aware for all time. This place is trying to help us. They are trying to help us. Though they do not understand us. We know them. They're angels." But her words became some unknown language after that. I wrote down their phonetic syllables, but they're meaningless as far as anyone, even experts, can tell. And I'm left with the horror of knowledge, the hunting paralysis born of what I've seen and heard, from the mouth of something who had died and been rebuilt. When we die, we stay where we lie. Our bones, our dust, remain aware for all time. Suicide is not the last thing on my mind. We must survive for as long as we can, no matter the cost, each and every single one of us. For death is not the end. No, death is just the start. The beginning of a lonely agony that will never end. Ever end, no matter how badly you want it. I thought being trapped in a box for a few days was bad, but now I know that death is worse. Now I travel from graveyard to graveyard, looking, hoping, begging to find that underground nightmare once more. I beg to be a part of the machine, a part of hell. I would make a deal with the devil, or worse, with those sleeping beings in the violet basilica. Take my flesh, if only so that I may live and breathe in some form. For death is without hope and without peace. Death has no escape and no air holes, no cramped limbs, no shouting for rescue. Death is being buried alive with nothing but your thoughts. Forever.